Hello and good afternoon. It's wonderful to be with you all today on this rainy, gloomy Thursday that we have here. At least it's rainy and gloomy in Maryland. Hopefully it's sunnier and brighter wherever you are. It's great to be with you. My name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And I'm excited to talk to you all today about strange, spooky, creepy, and gross stories, true stories from Civil War medicine. I see we have a ton of people already on here. People saying hello, chiming in the comments. I love to see that. Always love to hear where people are watching from, who all is joining me today. So thank you for being with us today on this Thursday afternoon. This is a real pleasure to be with you all here today. Again, for those of you just coming in, my name is John Lustrea. I'm the Education Coordinator of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. We got all kinds of exciting things in store for you today. Talking about strange tales of Civil War medicine. I'm seeing we got Barbara and Pat, Laura White in the comments. All kinds of great people tuning in. So this is wonderful. I'm really excited to be with you all. We're going to be talking about strange, gross, ghastly, ghoulish, creepy, and true stories related to Civil War medicine. But before we do that, just want to mention a couple things. Number one, something that really helps us immensely is if you like this video. That helps even more people get on here. I see we have a huge crowd already, 258 and counting. So that's really exciting. But if you like this video, more people will see it. If you share the video, more people can see it as well. That really helps expand our reach. And if you're new to these videos, we've been doing Facebook live streams like this all throughout the pandemic, the museum has. And if you want to make sure you can stay up to date with us, make sure and like our Facebook page, either before or during, or well, you can't do it before the video, but during or after this video, be sure to like us on Facebook to stay up to date with all the latest stuff that we're doing. We do at least 2 programs like this per week. And if you enjoy today's program, I know you'll love the program we're going to do on Halloween night. It is going to be pre-recorded, so it won't be live like this. But it involves reading a Civil War era spooky story written by a Civil War surgeon. It deals with all kinds of things. It's a favorite of the staff here. I know I'm excited to tune in and watch that. So all of that is helpful if you like our Facebook page, if you like this video, if you share this video. And then finally, what really helps us bring programming like this to you is to become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Our lowest level is only $25 per year. You don't have to renew if you don't want to. There'll be a link in the comments about how to become a member and join our organization. It would mean a whole lot to us, and it would mean a whole lot to me personally if you were to do so. So if you enjoy the video today, maybe consider doing that at the end. So with all that said, with all 325 of you, I'm going to go ahead and push on, and we're going to start getting to some strange tales here. And if you have any questions, ask them in the comments. They're flying pretty fast and furious already, but I'll try and keep up with them as best as I can. So with all that said, I got some pretty incredible images that I'm going to share with you all today. So let's go ahead and get that started here. All right, and in the background of this, you can see one of my favorite Harper's Weekly images of them carving a pumpkin. That's a post-Civil War, but still kind of a neat image. So, Civil War medicine, strange, spooky tales. Well, what often I think comes to mind when talking about Civil War medicine are amputations. And there's good reason that most people tend to think of those. There are over 60,000 amputations performed over the course of the entire Civil War. And at the center of all of these strange tales, and really Civil War medicine as a whole, comes after what happens if you're wounded on the battlefield. What does what do the various aspects of Civil War medicine look like? And of course, I'm only going to scratch the surface here today, but we're going to kind of very, very loosely kind of follow the path of a soldier who might have been wounded in a Civil War battle. And if you're shot in a limb, it's likely that you will at some point receive an amputation. Again, 60,000 amputations performed during the conflict. But one thing that's important to know about those, almost all of them, 95% plus, perhaps even as high as 99%, used anesthesia. So we're not getting into the creepy and gross yet. This is good news to start us off here. Anesthesia is used in almost 99% of Civil War surgery. You can see in this photograph from the Civil War them administering anesthesia, either dripping some chloroform or ether into a cloth and having the soldier breathe it in, or they also did have ether cones. It's a little bit hard to tell whether he's using like a little cone and put the rag over top of it in this image or not. But that's what's going on here. And here's another sketch. Again, it's so ubiquitous. You see this in a lot of Civil War amputation images. And I love this sketch in particular, because of the colors involved, and of course the immaculate facial hair sketched onto the characters here. So if you have an amputation that is done, you will very likely not feel any pain during the operation, which is good if you're a Civil War soldier. Now, how likely are you to survive an amputation? Well, it depends what you have amputated. My background's in history, not in science, but the further away from the core of your body, your kind of chest, heart area, the more likely you are to survive. That kind of makes sense. So if you lose a finger or a toe, we're talking, 2 to 3% chance of mortality rate. All the way up to if you lose a forearm, that's about a 15% mortality rate. All the way up to if you lose a leg at the hip, that's an 83% mortality rate. Now that's so high that some doctors wouldn't even do those operations, but I'm just giving you an idea of the range. So if you average it all out, it works out to about a 25% mortality rate for all amputations, which, not bad, not great, but that is you're twice as likely to survive an amputation if you're a Civil War soldier than if you're a civilian before the war. So, our technology, our knowledge, our savvy are progressing during the Civil War. You're more likely to survive. Now, here's where we start getting into the gross. What happens after you receive an amputation? Well, the answer in almost every single instance is pus. That's right, you tuned in here to hear everything you ever didn't want to know about Civil War pus. Pus was so common for people that had just received an amputation that it was thought to be a part of the healing process. Well, the reality is that the reason why there was so much pus when it came to Civil War amputations is we haven't discovered germ theory yet by the time of the Civil War. It's about 10 years in the future, roughly, the widespread discovery and acceptance of germ theory. So none of these doctors that you see in the sketch here are washing their hands. They're not cleaning their instruments between patients. And so almost every single patient gets an infection. It's just a matter of how severe it is, hence all the pus. There were two different kinds of pus as Civil War surgeons identified it. They would refer to either laudable pus, i.e. what they thought of as good pus, that means the wound is healing properly, or bad pus, which meant it wasn't healing properly. What we know today, the good pus, was either clear or yellowish in nature, a little kind of goopy. It didn't really have much of an odor. You can think of it a little bit as a very light kind of congealed mustard kind of color and texture. Not odor, it certainly didn't smell like mustard. Ideally it would smell like nothing, but that's the pus that they were hoping to see, either clear or kind of slightly yellow that's what they're looking for when the pus starts to show up. And basically that meant that they had a staph infection, which you don't want to have one of those, but it's better than the alternative, which bad pus was a lot thinner, very red, strong and pungent, and quite gross in terms of the odor. And that meant that you had some form of streptococcal infection, basically, which is what you don't want to have. And it means that there's a very high likelihood of death from either something like erysipelas, which I hope I'm saying right. Again, I'm a historian, not a not a doctor. I only play a doctor on TV. Erysipelas, or what the, and then there was another term that doctors, surgeons at the time would use, pymia, blood poisoning. Basically, all of these are results of the streptococcal infection, or you could have gangrene, which we'll get to in just a second here. I want to show this image just talking about why so many amputations were necessary. These are images of Civil War bones, recently recovered within the past 2-3 years from a bone pit on the Manassas battlefield. And they tell us a number of things. Number one, the image on the far left there shows what kind of damage a Civil War bullet can do to these bones. That's why so many amputations were necessary. And then the image on the far right there, you can see the saw marks from the surgeon's bone saw, which is really pretty incredible. And you can see that little edge, that's where the bone sort of basically broke off at the end. But the fact that it's as smooth as it is demonstrates that the surgeon performing this operation was extremely capable and was able to kind of keep a steady hand. And, you know, the end of the bone looks pretty much like it should. Now, gangrene. We'll talk about this poor gentleman here. This is a sketch from the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, which is an incredible resource. Streptococcal. Sorry, if you see me look down from time to time, that's me checking in on the comments. Michael is correcting me on my pronunciation. I appreciate that. Always looking to get a little bit better there. But this is a sketch from the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion. Incredible resource about Civil War medicine, all free, easy, and text searchable online. It's kind of challenging to work your way around. It's a snooze to read from front to back, but the information in there is incredible, including a number of great images like this. So gangrene is one of sort of the worst case scenario infections that a Civil War soldier could get. And it was recommended at the time that patients have at least 1,600 cubic feet to themselves in order to prevent the spread of hospital gangrene, which was kind of the more severe strain of this disease. So even back in the 19th century, they're already thinking in terms of space, you know, we're very aware of something like social distancing today, but they're aware that, you know, spreading people out lowers the spread of disease. And they're already familiar with ideas of quarantining, like if there would an outbreak of hospital gangrene would show up in a particular hospital, they would quarantine all the patients who had it in one particular wing of the hospital. So they're kind of loosely aware that disease does spread and kind of sort of how it spreads, and they kind of figure this out over the course of the war. Unfortunately, though, due to overcrowding in some Civil War hospitals, patients would only have about 175 cubic feet to themselves, or slightly less than a 6-foot cube or so. So this kind of social distancing that was ideal wasn't always possible. And at the height of you know, the kind of the early days of the COVID pandemic, at least in the United States, that the whole idea of overcrowding in hospitals became an issue. So, you know, even though we're talking about, you know, totally different time periods, different understandings of science, you know, what germ theory is and all that kind of stuff, we still grapple with sometimes similar issues to Civil War medicine. Now here's a description of hospital gangrene from Civil War surgeon Silas Weir Mitchell. He wrote that, quote, "A slight flesh wound began to show a gray edge, and within 2 hours, we saw this widening at the rate of ½ an inch an hour and deepening. Instant removal to open air tents, etherization, savage cautery, and with pure nitric acid or bromine, and dressings of powdered charcoal enabled us to deal with these cases more or less well, but the mortality was hideous, at least 45%. So hospital gangrene more or less means that you have about a coin flip to survive. Here. And even today, in events where gangrene does show up, the mortality rates are comparable, or they can be anyway. Over the course of time, they started to notice that using the same sponges to kind of dab the wounds, and reusing any dressings or any bowls, reusing uncleansed bowls contributed to the spread. And so they start to notice this, and then they require that everything be cleaned on a regular basis in order to stop the spreads. They're picking up knowledge as they go along. And over the course of the Civil War in 1864, Middleton Goldsmith, a Union surgeon in Missouri, I believe, ends up developing what I'm not sure I would say is a cure, but something that dramatically reduces the mortality rates, sprinkling bromine onto the wound, basically sterilizing the wound. They're not thinking about it like that. They don't really know what it is doing, but they start to notice through their data. They're keeping really intensive records of all of these cases. That does reduce the mortality rate. So it reduces the mortality rate when used, as Goldsmith is reporting this, from somewhere around close to 50% mortality rate down to near 2% mortality rate. That's quite a turnaround. And so as the war goes on, especially in the later days of the war, there are effective ways to recover from something like hospital gangrene. Well, thank you again. I'm trying to, well, we're not done yet. I'm just trying to keep track of the comments. I want to make sure I read a few of these. They're flying fast and furious because we have over 400 people here with us today, which is super fun. Mel says, watching from Indianapolis, Indiana, did my undergrad in medical and science history. It's absolutely fascinating to me. So thank you for tuning in, Mel. Glad you're with us. And if you're new with us today, again, my name is John Lustrea. I'm the education coordinator at the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. If you like this video, consider liking it. If you like the video, share the video, and you want more of the same here, be sure to like the National Museum of Civil War Medicine's Facebook page. We do about 2 of these programs a week. And we have a Halloween special coming up on Halloween night. So that should be a good one too. And if you can, sign up to become a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. It supports programming like this. Anyway, with that said, moving on to the next story. What happens, let's say, if you don't survive either an amputation or a bout with disease? Well, unfortunately, that means you'll probably die. And now this image is of battlefield deaths, but death, as Drew Gilpin Faust is quick to point out in her book, This Republic of Suffering, which is fantastic. Death, in many ways, is what defines the American Civil War. The whole 19th century conception of what death should be, ideally you should die in the home, peacefully, surrounded by your family and loved ones. But as we know today, looking at images like this, that was not always possible. In fact, it frequently didn't happen during the Civil War. And photographs like this, which were widely published during the Civil War, showed that war was not glorious. This kind of idealized good death didn't happen as much as people tended to think of. Now, looking at the soldiers in this photograph, what is going to happen to them? they all have families at home, and ideally, people in the 19th century want to be buried at home with their families. They, in the family plot and things like that. Well, getting these soldiers from there, and this is taken at Bloody Lane in Antietam, on the Antietam battlefield, getting them from there to back home, wherever that may be, whether it's Wisconsin, New York, Ohio, Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, wherever, is a bit of an ordeal, especially since the Civil War happens in the age before ID tags, dog tags. So none of these soldiers have any identification. And on top of that, there was no North or South. There was no government program or no government logistics for arranging to return individual remains home to their loved ones. So what typically happened on the battlefield, the remains were picked up by burial squads. And they were buried pretty much where they fell on the field. Burial detail was often given, well, it was always given to whichever side retained possession of the battlefield at the end of a given battle. And it was often seen as something of a punishment for some sort of military infraction by a company or a regiment. Or in the case of the Union Army, it was often done by contraband of war. These African Americans who had more often than not escaped slavery and were seized as contraband of war since they contributed to the Confederate war effort. And so as part of their duties, they would hang around in camp, and sometimes they would be called upon to bury the dead. As battle casualties increased, and depending on how fast the army had moved on, it became a quick burial of that side's dead with the remains of the enemy left on the field. So sometimes these graves were not terribly deeply dug or well dug. We'll get to that in a second here. It was not uncommon for battles to happen over the same ground in which they happened a year previous. This is a particularly haunting image, I believe near the Gaines Mill battlefield, which was repurposed or fought, the same ground was fought over again 2 years later at Cold Harbor. This is one of the more haunting photographs of the Civil War, one of many to me, not the least of which because of the skulls, but you can almost, at least the image there in the foreground, the body there, you can almost see the form of a person. I mean, it's clearly been disfigured by time and all manner of other things. And the fact that the shoes, which I have a replica shoe here, a Brogan, are still kind of on the feet. They're discernible, and it just makes you remember that, like, oh, this was a person not too long ago, and that kind of realization is pretty disturbing. Here's another image from the same series, perhaps even that same leg. And there you have a detail of contraband, burying the dead, gathering the remains and such. But it was not uncommon. It happened a number of times where the same ground was fought over, like here at Gaines Mill / Cold Harbor, 1st and 2nd Bull Run, the Battle of Fredericksburg. There's a second engagement a few years later. And I just happened to glance down. Andrea, one of our longtime viewers, asked if I can make these images available after the presentation. So the answer is actually almost all of these are publicly available in the Library of Congress. I'm sure I can do something. Maybe we can link to this PowerPoint or post a series of images, on the Facebook page or something. I'll talk with Jake, one of our other staff members, and we'll see what we can do. But thanks for asking that. And this image in particular, which is another haunting image that I want to talk about, and there's a quote that is associated with almost this, I mean, probably not with this, but you can imagine the soldier was looking at this. This is near the Wilderness and Chancellorsville battlefield. It's fought again over the same ground. This one Union soldier wrote, "Everywhere was strewn more or less with human bones and the skeletons of horses. In a spot less than 10 rods square, 50 skulls with their cavernous eyes were counted, their foreheads doming in silence above the brown leaves that were gathering about them." And if you didn't know better, you could, you'd say he'd be talking about this image exactly, which this was taken near the Chancellorsville Wilderness battlefields. Let's see here. Bodies on the battlefield, such as these, near the Rose Farm on the Gettysburg battlefield, they would typically be lined up, gathered, away from the more haphazard way in which they had fallen. They'd be lined up. They would, soldiers would dig a trench about approximately 2 feet deep, and often stack the bodies, 2 bodies deep, one man's torso on top of another man's legs. And here's another image taken just feet away from where that previous image was taken, again on the battlefield, the Gettysburg battlefield. Buried in these kind of very shallow graves. Ideally, again, they're not always, with these kind of real cheap wooden headboards here to mark the graves, so that if someone were to come back, they could be reinterred elsewhere. Now, wild hogs could often be a challenge, for people buried in these shallow graves, or in the event that a battle just happened and you're still wounded lying out on the battlefield. And I'm read a few quotes, all from the Gettysburg battlefield here, about the problem of hogs. So Lieutenant Inman of the 118th Pennsylvania was gravely wounded, lay on the northern edge of Rose's wheat field, so not too far from where this photograph is taken. He lay there for 2 days before being rescued on the morning of July 4th. He told doctors that he had spent all the previous night fending off hogs that were, quote, rooting and tearing at the dead men around me. Several pigs came upon him, and he jammed his sword in the belly of the largest, which, quote, made him set up a prolonged and sharp cry. By constant vigilance and keeping from sleeping, I contrived to fight the monsters off until daylight. So a pretty horrific scene to be a part of. Again, from the Gettysburg battlefield, by nightfall on July 3, as Sam Wilkeson and his fellow newspaper correspondents plied survivors for information before writing their dispatches to their newspapers, some men could hear hogs cut loose from pens by the 2 clashing armies, gorging on the bloating bodies. On Independence Day, July 4th, J. Howard Wirt, a young Gettysburg resident, saw body images there. One more story, Private Charles Drake of Bristol, New Hampshire, had his leg amputated and watched as a hog ate the discarded limb. Again, all pretty horrifying stories here. And I see that, hopefully I didn't cut out on you there. I see that my face is big again. Let me share my screen again and get us back to where we were. Hopefully, okay. I think we're now back. Sorry about that there, folks. Hopefully you stick with us here. And I'm keeping an eye on the screen to make sure the PowerPoint does eventually show back up again. And I still hear me here. Okay, I think I'm back. Again, sorry about the inconvenience, and hopefully this will get back on track. Okay. And there we are. Okay, I think we're all back on track here. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Okay, good. Looks like we're in good shape here. But anyway, as I was saying, the problem of hogs and pigs in the aftermath of Civil War battles rooting around in amongst the dead still remaining on the field. Plenty of fare for the hogs to get to. I'm just going to read a couple accounts of what battlefields were like in the aftermath of a battle. I'm going to read an account first from Daniel Holt, a surgeon from the 121st New York. This happens, he writes this account after the Battle of Antietam, about a week after the battle has happened. So this gives you an idea of how long this sort of horrific, disorienting scene continues. Surgeon Holt wrote, quote, "The dead were almost wholly unburied, and the stench arising from it was such as to breed a pestilence in the regiment. I have seen, stretched along in one straight line, ready for interment, at least 1,000 blackened, bloated corpses with blood and gas protruding from every orifice, and maggots holding high carnival over their heads. Such sights, such smells, and such repulsive feelings as overcome one are with difficulty described. Then add the scores upon scores of dead horses, adding to the commingling masses of corruption, and you have a very faint idea of what you see and can always see after a sanguinary battle. Every house for miles around is a hospital. And I've seen arms, legs, feet, and hands lying in piles, rotting in the blazing heat of a southern sky, unburied and uncared for. And still the knife went steadily in its work, adding to the putrid mess. So just an unthinkable scene that Surgeon Holt reports on. And to continue with the description of the Gettysburg battlefield, written by Clara Jones, a personal favorite of mine, a Union volunteer nurse. She writes about her time at Gettysburg. First, we crossed to the cemetery. A mile away from the battleground, we found unexploded shells of various sizes and shapes. The cemetery bears marks of rough usage. In many places, the iron railings are broken, monuments thrown down or splintered, trees barked up or torn, pieces of shell scattered around, the remains of dead horses and pieces of guns, belts, caps, and cartridge boxes, long lines of newly made graves, some of them opened, the bodies having been recovered by their friends. All these gave the otherwise beautiful spot a very desolate appearance. We could see where the hardest fighting took place without any guide. In one small field, I counted upwards of 50 dead horses, some with all the harnesses yet on. In 3 different places, 6 lay together, perhaps as in this photograph you're looking at right now. All the horses of the 3 batteries having been killed in their traces. I wish I could write down all I saw. I cannot tell you how the place looked. 2 long trenches running nearly the whole length of the field alone. We walked over the trenches and discovered in one place an entire skull peering from a hole. In another, a left hand. In another, 2 feet. And in another, the whole body, save the head, was exposed. They were hastily buried, and the rain helped work away the little dirt thrown on them. So again, truly horrific and awful scenes. This image that you're looking at here comes from the Gettysburg battlefield near the Trossel farm. Horses likely from Bigelow's battery, I think the 9th Massachusetts battery or so. Gettysburg in particular, I've been dwelling upon it for a while, not the least of which because it's the largest battle to take place during the Civil War. Or the largest 3-day battle anyway. Seeing forces, approximately 160,000 soldiers engaged, 60 to 90,000 horses and mules engaged in the battle there. There's just a lot left behind. And Gettysburg marks something of a turning point when it comes to the burial of dead soldiers and how the federal government sort of approaches the burial. So when both armies leave the battlefield on July 6th, they leave about 7,000 to 10,000 soldiers to be buried, dead soldiers, and an estimated 20,000 wounded to be cared for, and an estimated 7,000 dead horses. In total, an estimated 6 million pounds of human and animal carcasses. It boggles the mind to think of. As the Philadelphia Age reported July 20th, 1863, the ground was trampled into a bog and was covered with every conceivable thing: old broken muskets, bayonets and ramrods, pieces of wagons, broken wheels, cartridge boxes, belts, torn clothing, blankets, fragments of shells, and sometimes unexploded ones, bullets, cartridges, powder. Everything used in war or by soldiers was scattered around in plenty. The grain and grass was almost ground to jelly. Everywhere could be seen traces of the carnage. Hundreds of dead horses still unburied lay on the field, and in boggy places distant from town, many of the men were still unburied. And so to kind of address this issue, the citizens of Gettysburg are trying to say, what are we going to do with all this? Where are we going to put the bodies? And David Wills steps forward as Pennsylvania's agent to coordinate the state's relief efforts to ensure the proper and humane care of the wounded and dead left behind. And by the end of July 1863, this whole idea of a final resting place for the dead Union soldiers at Gettysburg started. Reinterments began into what would become the National Cemetery, the first of 5 that would eventually exist on Civil War battlefields. The others being at Antietam, Knoxville, Chattanooga, and Stones River. And they're only for Union soldiers, which isn't to say there aren't a few Confederates that ended up finding their way into these national cemeteries. Reinterments at Gettysburg began on October 23rd, 1863, a few months after the battle. And just to give you sort of a sense of the economy of all of this, reinterments, contractors get paid $1.59 per body. And one of the tasks for some of these people involves embalming the dead, an ancient practice, of course, going back to ancient Egypt. But embalming made a lot of strides during the Civil War because the ideal situation for a lot of these soldiers was to be sent back home, as I mentioned earlier, to their families. But railroad companies would not ship the body unless it had been embalmed. And so scenes like you see here would become fairly common in the days after a battle. Lots of great, horrible, and true stories related to Richard Burr, the embalming surgeon pictured there, but we don't really have time to get into too many of those today. Long story short, he's kind of a sleazy character and would often kind of cheat people out of any, the money that they paid him. They'd pay up front for embalmings, and he would never go find them. He's a whole other story. But all this to say, embalming was a part of this kind of reinterment process. The National Cemetery at Gettysburg, of course, dedicated on November 19th, 1863, with the keynote speaker, as we all know, Edward Everett, not Abraham Lincoln. Edward Everett delivers a thundering 2-hour oration, basically about the history of the Battle of Gettysburg. It's sort of the first history ever written, if you will, about the battle. And then Lincoln follows that up with a 2.5-minute speech, which is, of course, one of the greatest speeches in American history. And as Edward Everett would later say, Lincoln got closer to the heart of the matter in 2 minutes than I did in 2 hours. But Edward Everett was the keynote speaker that day. Anyway, burials, and here's an image of the National Cemetery today. With the flags there marking graves. They have them separated out by state there. Burials of the Union dead found on the Gettysburg battlefield were completed in May of 1864. Reinterments of soldiers buried in local cemetery continued over time, and indeed certainly for Confederate burials. And occasionally bodies would turn up on the Gettysburg battlefield, most recently in the summer of 1997. And it is a certainty that there are still bodies on the Gettysburg battlefield and likely on just about every Civil War battlefield. So the map that I'm sharing with you here in this image is done by a gentleman with the last name of Elliott. I'm blanking on his first name, but they actually went out and mapped the individual resting place of every individual grave and person that they could locate. Each of those little hash marks that you see there on the map represents a body, and you can kind of see where the heavy fighting was. So that cluster down there amongst the woods, that's in the wheat field, which of course famously changed hands a host of times, and you can see the bodies all kind of spread out throughout there. And he did these maps for Gettysburg. There's a series of these. He also did some for Antietam and likely other battlefields as well. But this is an ambitious undertaking. It's certain that some were missed or in the process of reinterment. Not all of these are accounted for. So it is, I am positive that there are a number of bodies that still remain on Civil War battlefields today. And one turned up at Antietam in the 21st century. I want to say 2010 or ish, 2012, somewhere in there. I could be wrong, but it definitely turned up in the 21st century. So they're out there, still waiting to be discovered, which is pretty wild to think about. Now, enough talk about death and things. Now it's time to talk a little bit about what happens after death, which gets into a very popular 19th century movement that only gained steam and momentum during the Civil War, and that is spiritualism. This is the belief that spirits of the dead have both the ability and the inclination to communicate with the living. The afterlife, or the spirit world, is seen by spiritualists not as a static place, but as one in which spirits continue to evolve. These two beliefs, that contact with the spirits is possible and that spirits are more advanced than humans, lead spiritualists to a third belief, that spirits are capable of providing useful knowledge about moral and ethical issues. So this whole idea of spiritualism, that spirits are out there and can be contacted, gained a lot of traction in the 19th century, and especially during the Civil War. Think about it. Relatives of these loved ones, who died far from home, unknown deaths, never got to hear about, hear what their relatives' last words were, or, what have you. They're just desperate for one final connection. And of course, religion of all sorts was a great comfort. Christianity, of course, relied upon heavily the most, Protestantism and all of the associated denominations was, by far and away the most popular religion in the United States. But the spiritualist movement picked up a lot of traction, the idea that you could communicate with the dead. And it predates the Civil War, but the large amount of death only increases the popularity of this movement. Abraham Lincoln himself leans into this a little bit, or perhaps more accurately, his wife, Mary Todd, with the death of their son, Willie, in 1862 from, smallpox, yellow fever, cholera, dysentery, one of those. I'm certain one of the, someone in the comments, I'm blanking on the what he dies of, but there's an epidemic in Washington, D.C. It has something to do with drinking water. Scarlet fever, maybe. Anyway, he passes away, and Mary Todd, desperate, and it just wrecks the Lincoln family. Lincoln famously is intensely depressed. Thank you, John Willen. You come to my rescue yet again. Typhoid fever, Willie dies of. Lincoln famously gets very depressed. I mean, I'm not sure he was the most cheery person to ever walk the earth before Willie's death, but afterwards he's really thrown into intense depressions. And Mary Todd deals with a little bit differently. She turns to spiritualism, and they famously hold a seance in the White House to get to this. And Lincoln is, in some corners mocked for doing this, but in some ways it's more sort of a testament to show kind of how pervasive this was. But spiritualism, this whole idea, predates the Civil War. Seances were a common way to kind of commune with the spirits, and the Fox sisters here kind of really popularized this in 1848. They took part in the first recorded spirit rapping. The whole idea they're holding a seance, and that there's a particular tapping or a rapping, tap, 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 rap, 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 of something in some sort of Morse code, and all that to communicate some sort of message. According to reports at the time, Margaret and Kate Fox succeeded in establishing some sort of ghostly dialogue with the spirit of Charles B. Rosna, something like that. Using rapping noises as a means of communication, the spirit conveyed the message that he had been killed and buried in the basement of the sisters' home. When the bones were found in their basement, the Fox sisters became almost an overnight sensation. Over the years, they continued to give seance demonstrations, attracting a devoted following, along with numerous imitators and, of course, critics. Initially, spiritualist gatherings were concerned with demonstrating and investigating mental phenomena such as clairvoyance, telepathy, and the reception of messages from spirits. And these messages were often conveyed through mediumship. These people would sometimes be referred to as mediums, as you know, they're kind of vessels for whatever sort of spiritual or ghostly message that passes through them. Sometimes it's supposed to be an active thing; they're aware of what's happening. Other times they're in some sort of a trance. You know, they're not conscious of what they're undergoing. One of the other more common or more popular spiritualists of the 19th century was this woman here, quite a name, Cora Laudencia Veronica Scott, lived from 1840 to 1923. And her audiences were typically struck by the contrast between her physical girlishness. She was pretty young, you know, only in her 20s by the time the Civil War broke out, and she was a kind of a phenomenon before the Civil War. They were struck the contrast between her youth and the notion that the spirits were speaking through her. During the latter half of the 19th century, a number of spiritualist mediums began to advocate for the use of specialized tools for conducting seances. Particularly in leader-assisted sessions conducted, of course, in darkened rooms. Some of the tools that were commonly used, something called a spirit trumpet, a horn-shaped speaking tube, kind of like a cheerleader horn, and the idea was that it would magnify whispered voices of spirits from an inaudible to an audible range, basically kind of like a microphone is how they're thinking about it. Spirit slates, two chalkboards that they would bind together, and when opened, the slate would reveal a message that had supposedly been written by the spirits. A seance table, which is what you're looking at right here, was a special lightweight table which were said to rotate, float, or even levitate when the spirits were present. A type of seance in which participants sit around a table, they all place their hand on it and wait for rotations. The idea being everyone can sort of feel when this was happening. And as Deborah correctly points out, so you couldn't see under the table, the darkened room, yes, exactly so. Spirit cabinets were also a pretty good thing, and this is an image of the Davenport Brothers, another kind of famous spiritualist sibling combination. And the whole idea behind the spirit cabinets, you can see the ropes there. The medium would go in, they'd be tied up, along with some musical instruments. The doors would be closed. You'd hear some sort of cacophony of music or sound from inside the spirit cabinet, and that was interpreted in some way as a message from the spirits. The cabinets would open, and you'd see the medium would still be there with their hands and arms and legs bound. All manner of goodies and things used to commune with the spirits, but grieving families in the aftermath of the Civil War turn pretty heavily towards these kind of spiritualist mediums, desperate for one kind of final connection with their loved ones who had died a gruesome and kind of alarming death far from home. So that kind of gives you sort of an idea, the path of, through the creepy, the gross, and the ghoulish of Civil War medicine, both and your wounding during your death and after your death, if you will. So I hope you enjoyed strange tales of Civil War medicine. I know I certainly did. And here's the image I started the program with. If you like this video, please consider liking this video, sharing this video, and liking the National Museum of Civil War Medicine on Facebook. Again, we do programs like this 2 times a week. So if you like us, you can keep up to date with all the latest that we are up to. We have plenty of time for questions here. I'll hop over and start looking at those. Again, a advertisement on Halloween evening at 8 p.m. Jake will be doing a reading of one of our favorite Civil War ghost stories, basically, written in 1866 by a Civil War surgeon. The Curious Case of George Deadlow. You won't want to miss that one. It's a personal favorite of ours. So definitely tune in for that. If you like this and other videos, they will continue to exist on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. Go check those out, some of the ones you may have missed. You'll find perhaps a topic that might interest you. And if you want to support our programming, please consider becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. There's a link in the comments. Becoming a member helps us immensely and continues to let us do what we do. So with all that said, I'll turn to the comments here. I've been kind of trying to keep an eye on them. They're flying fast and furious. Appreciate how active you're all being. So I'll try and get to some of these comments here and questions. Let me see here. Connie says, suggested reading This Republic of Suffering. Absolutely. That's a great read and covers and served as an inspiration for a lot of what I was talking about here today. Yeah, I saw someone earlier asking about sources for some of the stuff I was talking about. This Republic of Suffering is a big one. There's also, and I'm blanking on the title, it's through Savas Beatty, I believe, but there's a whole book about the burial of Civil War dead, which I drew from. Of course, I'm blanking on the title about that, but that's a good volume. The images, the vast majority were from the Library of Congress, so they're all publicly available. If you poke around enough, you can find a lot of them on our website, actually, as well. But if you want a link to the PowerPoint or some of the specific images, I'll get with Jake, our social media manager, and see what we can do, see if we can get those out there if you want. Let's see, Robert Smith asked, John, can you comment on the concept of a good death, which many wounded soldiers seem to indicate they wanted in their letters and memoirs? Great question, Robert. Talked about pretty heavily in, and concept is, well, I shouldn't say pioneered, but popularized by Drew Gilpin Faust in This Republic of Suffering, the book I was just talking about. The whole idea is that, if you're going to die, you should die at home, peacefully, surrounded by your loved ones so they can hear you utter your last words. And they can be certain of your good Christian character and that you will go to heaven. And your last words, ideally, would have something to the effect of, how you were a good Christian your whole life and all this. For a deeper exploration of that, I'd point you to one of our previous streams a week or two ago it's called Civil War Medicine and the Body, kind of about how the Civil War really throws a wrench into that by all these gruesome anonymous deaths far from home. So that's just a thumbnail sketch about that. Michael says, with a name like Davenport, I'm surprised they used a cabinet instead of a sofa. I love that. Let's see here. Just flipping through the comments. David Heim says, very interesting. Thanks for presenting the program. Judy says, had no idea this would entail. It was a learning experience. Glad you enjoyed it. Julie Dickinson says, thanks for a great program. I'm a happy member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. Thank you, Julie, for supporting what we do. We really appreciate it. Let me see here. Arlene asks, was it boric acid that was sprinkled on wounds to prevent infection? It's only referred to in the sources that I've explored, which is the Medical and Surgical History of the War of the Rebellion, all freely publicly available online. Great resource. They only refer to it as bromine. I don't know enough about science to know if bromine and boric acid are the same thing or not. If the answer is yes, then yes. If the answer is no, then different thing. But just critically to note, they're not sprinkling that on every wound. They're typically only applying that to cases of gangrene. So they're being, they're picking and choosing where they're applying it. And they're also not exactly aware what exactly it's doing. So they know it's helping, but they don't really know too much about the science behind it. Kim Paul asks, any personal paranormal type experiences at Civil War battlefields or sites? Thoughts on the topic? Well, certainly a number of people have claimed to have experiences of that nature. I never have. I certainly wouldn't be so certain as to say that, nothing like that will ever happen to me, in a site with so much death. I mean, I'm certainly open to the possibility that, who knows? But nothing like that has ever happened to me specifically. Liz says, what if they give for pain other than morphine? Basically, a host of opium-based products where they're primary, and I would add effective painkiller. Now that also contributes to, it's not the sole cause, it contributes to a nationwide opium addiction crisis after the Civil War. So there are some downsides to this effective painkiller. It's used in both the Union and the Confederacy, but we have better data for the Union Army. In the Union Army alone, over the course of the 4 years of the Civil War, 10 million doses of opium are given. So this is liberally distributed. Let me see here. Barbara says, thought the video to be extremely interesting. Made a beautiful display of the Civil War in a diorama type setup. Who would I contact to see if they're interested in this beautiful setup, all hand painted? Would love to donate. You can reach out to us via Facebook message, or there are ways you can get in touch with us on our website. But yeah, we'd love to take a look, Barbara. Let's see, Jerry says, do you have any information on Satterley Hospital in Philadelphia? Treated both blue and gray. Satterley Hospital in Philadelphia is the largest single Civil War hospital, capable of holding nearly 5,000 patients at its height. It would primarily treat Union soldiers, I would imagine. I haven't looked super in depth to this, but if Confederate prisoners would be in need of long-term recovery, I'm certain they would be just as likely to be sent there as anywhere else. It certainly had the space for everyone. And I know that there was a newsletter, kind of a hospital newspaper that was published that I think you can access today through Library of Congress. Blanking on what it's called, but there is information out there about Satterley, and it's a really incredible place and the site of a lot of research during the Civil War, a lot of discovery about nerve injuries conducted there. Deborah asks, what was the average educational level during the time period? I can't speak too much to kind of the quote unquote the general education level. Literacy rates were remarkably high in the United States. Now, of course, this goes with the caveat that enslaved African Americans were prevented from learning to read or write, so it doesn't apply in that instance. But amongst the white male population, literacy was, I think I've read, in like the 70% range, maybe even higher than that. So that's why we have such a wealth of information from Civil War soldiers, because they wrote an awful lot of letters because they could read. So it was on average pretty high. See, Andrea correctly notes that Ambrose Bierce was another great writer, spooky short stories. His most famous story is An Occurrence at Owl Creek Bridge, which if you've read anything by him, you probably read that. But he has a host of other kind of creepy stories, many of which were inspired by his Civil War service, a lot of which were pretty disturbing. Jenny says, do you have an online bookshop we can order these books from? Not really. If you want to reach out to try and order something from us, you can contact us at store, S-T-O-R-E, at civilwarmed.com. and you can inquire there to see if you have something we're looking for. I mean, I know we sell this Republic of Suffering, and see if we have anything else you're possibly interested in. Well, there are other questions. There's an awful lot of you here in the comments. It's been a joy to be with so many enthusiastic viewers here. But we're just about out of time here. Thank you so much for tuning in. I had a great time with you all. I hope you all enjoyed your time spent with me. You learned something. You learned some gross stuff. And tune in on Halloween night at 8 o'clock to hear Jake read The Curious Case of George Deadlow. Great Halloween spooky story from the Civil War, fictional account, but still a good one. Tune in to catch that. If you can't make the live broadcast, you can find it on our Facebook page or YouTube channel. And as always, like our Facebook page, like this video, share this video, and become a member of the museum if you can. It's these memberships, they really go a long way towards helping us continue to bring videos like this to you. So thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Until next time.